Have you ever heard the argument that the apostles of Jesus all died brutal deaths, being stabbed to death, skinned alive, crucified, and therefore they didn't make up the resurrection, and Christianity must be true? I heard an argument quite similar to this growing up and found it quite compelling. But recently I decided to dig deeper and examine the historical evidence that the apostles actually died as martyrs. What I found was not only surprising, but quite powerful. Here are 5 key points of what I found. The first point to understand is what is meant by an apostle. When we look at the beginning chapters of Acts, we see that the disciples are coming up with a replacement because of Judas, who had betrayed Jesus. And there's 2 criteria that they utilize. One, the replacement had to have been with Jesus since his baptism by John the Baptist. And second, the replacement to be in the 12 had to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. The second point is to understand that the earliest message that the apostles preached was that Jesus had risen from the grave. From the letters of Paul to the book of Acts, where we see the first Christians going out and building the church, the message that they gave was always tied to the resurrection. There is no early Christianity apart from the belief that Jesus rose from the grave. The third point is that the apostles preached a message in direct opposition to the Roman state. When the apostles stood up and said that Jesus is God, they were essentially saying that Caesar is not. They were proclaiming that a criminal against the Roman state was the risen Lord. They preached a message that made them enemies of the Roman state. And the fourth point is that the apostles would not stop preaching the risen Jesus, even when they were threatened, beaten, and thrown in prison. If you look at the beginning of the book of Acts, they are told by the religious leaders, just stop proclaiming that Jesus is Lord and we'll leave you alone. But they refuse. They refuse to stop saying that Jesus has risen from the grave. In fact, in Acts chapter 5, Peter stands up when they're being threatened and he speaks on behalf of the apostles. He says we can't. We must obey God rather than men. Regardless of whether we accept some of the later grisly apocryphal accounts about the deaths of the apostles, what we know for sure is that all the apostles were willing to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus had conquered the grave. And the fifth point is that there is good historical evidence that at least some of the apostles actually died as martyrs. Take James, the brother of Jesus, for example. There's an account from Josephus, a Jewish writer, at the end of the 1st century. Take James, the brother of John. There's an evidence, a recording of his death in Acts 12:2 at the hands of Herod. And there are multiple pieces of evidence, different documents, pointing out from the 1st and 2nd century that both Peter and Paul died as martyrs. And there is no evidence that any of the apostles recanted their beliefs.
Wait right here.
You might be thinking, wait a minute, what about all the other people throughout history who've been willing to die for their beliefs? In fact, what about modern day Muslim terrorists who die for their faith? Does that mean Islam is true? Yet here's an important distinction to keep in mind. They weren't eyewitnesses of Muhammad doing miracles or allegedly receiving the Quran. At best, they received their convictions 4th, 5th, or 6th hand from somebody else. Their deaths provide no more evidence for the truth of Islam than my own death, if I died as a martyr, would provide evidence for Christianity. But the apostles were eyewitnesses. They saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. So if we conclude that they made it up, we'd have to say that they died for something that they knew was false. And that's difficult to believe. This alone doesn't prove that Christianity is true, but it does show the depth of the sincerity of the apostles. They weren't making this story up. They weren't liars. This wasn't a big conspiracy. They were willing to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus had risen from the grave. I wonder, What else could the apostles have done to convince us of the depth of the sincerity of their beliefs?
To the right.